So Professor Keith's somebody I've known for a very long time. She's also, you'll hear in her career, it's an interesting path, and we'll get to that. But one of the things that she did that has really always struck me as incredibly effective is that she took on, after the passage of the Affordable Care Act, the tracking the ups and downs through the legal system, through congressional action of the Affordable Care Act. And we had some close calls with the Affordable Care Act almost getting repealed, the Supreme Court almost overturning it. And by being fair, clear, direct, and really informative, she became like the defining storyteller of this process, at least among health policy folks that I know. And that is really a gift, because it is, especially in today's age, it's one of those things where being able to communicate in a way that people respect from all sides is really valuable. So anyway, welcome. We're excited to have you here, but we'll hear all about that. But let's start at the beginning. So I always ask, as you know, people like, where did you grow up, and like when everyone here is in college, so maybe you can help us get a sense of what you were doing in those days, what you were thinking about, and then how your career led you to where we are.
No, sure. And it goes without saying, you all are very lucky to have Professor Monahan as your professor. He knows all the things about everything, and just such a wealth of knowledge and kindness and support and generosity for me and many, many other people all throughout DC and across the country. So I know there were a couple folks from Texas. I grew up in Amarillo, Texas,
Wow.
Believe it or not.
I thought you grew up in Austin.
Yeah, well, I hide it well. Amarillo, Texas, ironically, has been in the news a little bit more than normal. If you read anything about some of the abortion litigation, there's a well-known judge at this point making a lot of nationwide decisions coming out of Amarillo, Texas, which, for those of you who are familiar with U.S. geography, it's like if Oklahoma continued. It's like the panhandle of Texas up north. It's West Texas in the middle of nowhere. If you've ever seen the show Friday Night Lights, feels like a documentary. That is a little bit where I grew up. I went to college in Austin at the University of Texas. I studied neuroscience. I'm a former biology person, and had sort of an interesting path there. I really enjoyed science, did a lot of STEM in high school, even went to the Texas Academy of Mathematics and Science, which is nerd school, before I finished up at the University of Texas. I remember, and I had always felt called to public service, and actually joined the Peace Corps. So for some of the foreign service, it's very different, but was very anxious to do some international health work in particular. So lived in Ghana in West Africa for 2 years. I started there when I was 19 because I had graduated college a bit early. And so
You graduated college when you were 19?
I did, because of this nerd school I went to.
Wow. Well, we're going to program that, but go ahead, please.
And so was there. Most of my friends who I had studied neuroscience with went off to medical school, and I decided instead to go and do the Peace Corps. And I just, sometimes you have those really clarifying moments. Maybe you've had one now, or maybe you will in the future. But I remember asking one of my friends how he liked it when I was home for Christmas one year. And I remember him very clearly saying to me, I know what I'm doing for the rest of my life, when he talked about medical school. And that was good for him. I remember thinking, like, that's not going to work for me. Like, I'm living in a village in West Africa. I want to be doing all these different things. For him and many other people in my life, that is what they wanted. And it really crystallized for me that that's probably not the path that I wanted to go on. And so my compromise with myself, for better or worse, I had managed to brainwash myself into thinking I needed a terminal degree at that point. Then I needed to practice something. I decided to do a JD with a master's in public health, so a law degree and a public health degree. That was my compromise. I knew I wanted to continue to do healthcare work. I'm not sure how much more I thought about it than I want to be the person that bosses the doctors around, so I'll be the lawyer. That's obviously what I should do. I didn't really have much more of a path than that. But I also knew I wanted to come to DC. Sort of always kind of been a dead ringer for a health policy person. I think those of you who've done volunteer work or public service, one of the things I've noticed throughout my career is I like to do hands-on things and work with individuals, whether I'm, have done things like that in my past or have done volunteer work. And then it's not fast enough and you need to move bigger. And so I want to get back to the policy work, and it's sort of the cycle that continues on. So I always knew I wanted to have an impact in what I was doing, which is really what sort of led me to believe I wanted to move to DC. Fast forward, I decided to do the JD MPH program at Georgetown Law with the master's at Johns Hopkins. And so the Bloomberg School of Public Health, is pretty well known for its global health. I was very much on kind of a global health path, if you will. I think with Peace Corps, I had done a lot of HIV work, a lot of, I was a teacher in a secondary school, so I was teaching high school science, which meant a lot of, teaching about health and sex ed and HIV work in addition to community development projects. So had been on that path until I was in law school when the Affordable Care Act passed, which, to age myself, was back in 2010. And I remember, again, sort of thinking, we don't do this very often in this country. We don't do domestic health reform in the United States very often. So I should probably pay attention to whatever that is. And so in a sort of an opportunistic move, sought out research assistant opportunities at the McCourt School at the Center on Health Insurance Reforms. And we'll give you more of the rundown, but I've pretty much been associated with them for the rest of my career. Really made a huge difference in my career. And if someone had told me, stepping back, Katie, you're going to do private health insurance work, that is what you were going to focus your career on, is private health insurance, I would have laughed them out of the room because it sounds awful. And it became really sort of a means to an end to do some of the equity work that I wanted to do. I got very involved in LGBTQ health work and a lot of things like transgender health insurance exclusions that are now getting a lot more attention for worse. A lot of racial and ethnic health disparities through the private health, Medicaid expansion, all of these big programs that I think at their core are so fundamental to our healthcare system, but that I sort of made that leap without kind of knowing what that would look like, but I'm very glad that I did. And then, well, I shouldn't say I'll pause there. As you said, I've had many permutations there. That was sort of the jumping off point. Over the course of however many years, I've had different faculty roles at the McCourt Public Policy School at Georgetown, at the law school, have done some consulting work for nonprofits and foundations. I was very fortunate, as John mentioned, in 2018, I inherited from one of my dear mentors, Tim Jost, a well-known law professor at Washington and Lee, this sort of blog at the journal Health Affairs. And Tim and I had worked together for many years. He sort of plucked me out. I had no idea this was also going to happen. And he said, will you take over this for me? He needed to step back, even though he's still active now. Guy. Wonderful, brilliant, kind, expert, all the things. And I wrote that column for about 5 years, mostly through the Trump administration and then the beginning of the Biden administration. And it really became a way to, as John said, track everything that was going on, both with the Affordable Care Act. I also wrote about other major laws that happened, a lot of the COVID relief packages that Congress passed. So if you've heard of laws like the American Rescue Plan, the Inflation Reduction Act, the No Surprises Act, sort of anything. I'm very intellectually curious. I can get into just about anything if you put it in front of me, and I have the opportunity to write about it. So sort of ended up expanding to a lot of different topics. Then the sort of pivot I'll make, and then I'll stop talking about this, is...
No. I got a couple questions, but this is all good. This is great.
I am a lawyer. I did go to Georgetown Law. I took the bar exam. I'm inactive, so unlike many of my colleagues, I did not practice law. Again, was always going to sort of have this policy career. And I'm about the furthest thing you could get from a litigator. There is not enough money you could pay me to go to court and argue a case. I'm just not that type of lawyer. However, doing this, blog for Health Affairs, I was tracking an incredible amount of litigation on a regular basis. So a little bit of a step back is the Affordable Care Act has been the most litigated piece of social legislation in history. The number of lawsuits, including sort of the several big existential legal challenges that John noted. We've been up to the Supreme Court 3 times where the entire law could have fallen or major parts of it would have fallen so that it would have crumbled. And then there's been a ton of litigation around implementation of the law. So, the Obama administration did this rule and then it was sued, and then the Trump administration reversed it and that was sued, and then the Biden administration did it again. And now Trump too will do it again and we'll sue again. There's a ton of cases. So when I was doing this early on, I was probably tracking at least 50 to 60 lawsuits at any given time. And so what that meant is I was pulling the docket, looking at the briefs, reading the court decisions, and then writing about them. And so even as a non-litigator, I built up what was a pretty incredible knowledge of how the litigation worked, some of the judges, those kinds of things, and felt like sort of on the leading edge of understanding what was coming and the intersection between health policy and the courts. And sort of this I think, estimated area. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely huge areas of health policy where the courts have always played an important role. Reproductive health is a good example. Environmental law, for example, is another. Tobacco regulation is even some public health. But I sort of anticipated what we saw in sort of the playbook on the Affordable Care Act has now been expanded to every time we do health policy litigation or health policy on the Hill. So we've seen similar litigation over the new provisions for Medicare drug negotiation, for example. There's, a lot of the drug companies have filed constitutional challenges over this, first time ever that Medicare has been able to negotiate for the prices it pays for prescription drugs. We've seen it over the No Surprises Act, which protected consumers from surprise medical bills. This is a classic. Hopefully this has not happened to anyone in this room, but maybe you go in for a surgery, you don't know that your anesthesiologist, you're literally out and under, you don't know that your anesthesiologist is out of network. And so you get a bill for thousands of dollars later. Another, prominent instance that happens is with an air ambulance. You're hurt, you don't know who you're calling, and you don't have time to check if that company works with your insurance company. You just need care. And so consumers were getting charged exorbitant bills, so Congress stepped in to sort of fix it. There have been regulations implementing it, and an incredible amount of litigation brought by hospitals and doctors and insurance companies as well, et cetera, et cetera. And so it has, I think, created, it sort of led me to start a new initiative at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law that John is also a very important part of, focused on this intersection. And a lot of it is explaining the link here. There's some examples where it's very obvious that things are going to go to court, and people my pitch to you, if you remember nothing else, is as sort of public policy professionals, health or otherwise, I think recognizing the role that the courts and litigation play is kind of the next frontier of what we're doing. And so that would be my one takeaway is we have to be paying attention to all of it. It used to be that you could sort of get your preferred outcome. You would go to Congress and lobby.
That would be
it.
That'd be it. Just the first step.
After that, became going to Congress and then going to lobby the federal agencies, Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Labor, go get the agency to implement what you want them to do. And now you have to do both of those steps and think about what happens when that policy that you have fought for, sometimes for many, many years through both of those branches of government, goes to the third branch of government, which is the courts. And so it means there's different types of advocacy. It is everything from what comments am I going to write on whatever regulation the agency has put out so that I can tee up a legal challenge and make them respond to it, to who's the advocate I'm going to have in the courtroom arguing on my behalf, and then who are the amicus briefs, the sort of friend of the court briefs, who I want weighing in on my side, and what are the arguments that might not be legal but that we want to make sure the court knows about. So there's a whole strategy now around what goes into sort of winning or securing good outcomes in a lot of these cases. And as doing that work, as a newfound sort of court watcher, I think a lot of us, those who follow the litigation over abortion access and reproductive rights, knew as early as 2021, the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade in June of 2022, but those who understood the courts they signaled that they were going to do this as early as September of 2021 when they ruled on I don't know if folks would remember this, but Texas bounty hunter abortion law. So this law that Texas passed that said, you can kind of take your neighbor to court if anyone aids and abets an abortion. So it could be the Uber driver. It could have been, a neighbor, something like that. So created this sort of novel scheme that essentially banned abortion at 6 weeks in Texas, even with Roe versus Wade still good law. Seeing that, there were several of us who started to work to think about, what can the Biden administration do? What can the federal, not even the Biden administration, what can the federal government do, frankly, if and when this constitutional right is overturned? What are some of the, important programs? Where is there flexibility, if there is any, et cetera? And so we started to write memos and do some really quiet analysis, and provided a lot of that to the person who would then become my boss, Jennifer Klein, who was director of the White House Gender Policy Council. The Gender Policy Council was the first one that's ever existed. It was created by President Biden by executive order in March of 2021, and the goal was really to...
Could you describe what a policy council is?
Yeah, absolutely.
So in the White House, there are different... the National Security Council is probably the most well-known,
Yeah.
but presidents get to decide. So you want what...
No,
how this emerged.
and please jump in. So there, as I said, there's multiple different of these policy councils. National Security Council sort of does what it sounds like and advises the president on national security issues. You also have the Domestic Policy Council, which folks might have heard of, which sets a lot of, in theory, domestic policy. I'm saying in theory because all these things sort of overlap. You also have the National Economic Council. And so those have, I think, historically been the three main ones. They work on pretty much anything you can think of. President Biden then created the Gender Policy Council to run parallel to those. So we worked very closely with colleagues at each of those policy councils that we just referenced. And the task he gave us was to embed gender equity and equality across all domestic and foreign policy. And so really wanted that lens across everything that we did, and felt strongly enough about it to really create a policy council to advise him on it. We were nowhere near the size of those other policy councils, but I would say, sort of small but mighty, and managed to get a lot done. I also don't know if President Biden knew when he did that in early 2021 that Roe would fall. But I sort of am grateful that he did, because that work on reproductive rights for the administration had a very natural place to live. And so suffice to say, I was sort of doing this work on the outside, trying to be helpful as a researcher, and then was asked to come in and serve in the White House, which I did for a little bit over 2 years. First as a senior advisor for health policy, and then I came on as deputy director of the Gender Policy Council itself. And there, I'll just mention it in case it's interesting. We don't have to spend too much time on it. I think, obviously worked a ton on women's health issues, so reproductive rights, maternal health, LGBTQ health, women's health research, which we worked on very closely with Dr. Biden, First Lady, to close disparities in women's health research that the more you talk about them make me crazy. So if anyone is interested in that, would always be happy to talk. And that got me a lot of working with the NIH, working with the Department of Defense, the Department of Veterans Affairs, really got, I think, a broad view of how a lot of different parts of government operate. When I became deputy director, I was responsible for our entire domestic policy portfolio. So that meant I did a lot of work on the Title IX regulation, for example, with the Department of Education. Got really smart about campus sexual assault, grievance procedures, pregnancy protections for students and employees, those kinds of work, or that kind of work. Implementation of the Violence Against Women Act, which had its 30th anniversary earlier this year, so a lot of gender-based violence issues, online harassment and abuse, which disproportionately impacts women and girls, and LGBTQ folks, and then women's economic security as well, so equal pay, child care, paid leave, and the work we did was everything from, working on president's budget proposals, to working with agencies on guidance and proposed regs, to doing a lot of,
Sure.
litigation response. So, last year.
So your legal training turned out to be helpful.
It turned out to be helpful. I think in multiple ways. I think what I know about myself is I like to do a lot of different things. Like, you want to torture me, you lock me in a room and make me focus on one thing. I like to be sort of to keep up, and I like to work on things. I have learned this about myself, probably the hard way, that are in the headlines. I like to work on the issues of the day. The Affordable Care Act, which is not as controversial now, you probably don't even know what we're talking about, but it used to be very, very controversial. LGBTQ healthcare, abortion access.
Right.
I have found that I want to be sort of in the fight, which is an important thing to know about yourself, I think. But then the legal training, it means I found my skills to be very transferable.
Okay.
Really built up the analytical skill, as opposed to kind of going deep on one topic. For me, I like being able to be a good writer, read something and be curious enough to sort of figure it out after it. And then you apply sort of political skills and skills working across the government. And that is probably the perfect complements to enable me to go in and work on a whole bunch of different issues in a pretty intense environment.
Well, one advantage of a law degree, since a lot of folks here are thinking about what to do with the rest of their next steps of their lives, but you studied to get your MPH and your law degree, I know sort of back to back. I can't remember what the sequence is. We do it with Hopkins now. But those are two fairly different sets of skills. Not to simplify things,
right.
but an MPH is a lot about data, about analysis, sort of the even-handed assessment of complex information. Law is, I think, I don't know if you agree with it, it is about how you take evidence and you put it in the form of an argument. So you know what conclusion you want, and you marshal the evidence. Those are two kind of interesting ways to approach. I guess I'd love your thoughts. Is which of the two is best prepared you, or is the combination the sweet spot for you?
It's a great question, and you're totally right. I remember nothing except that I took epidemiology and biostatistics and really important classes like that. For me, my career has evolved in such a way that the skills from law school have prepared me tenfold. But I think it really depends on the type of career that you want to have. For me, I want to work on different things. So I've gone from Affordable Care Act to reproductive health care to Title IX and specializing in something through a master's program or a PhD, something like that, probably would have been limiting there. I will also say, of course, the master's program that I did was 1 year, whereas law school is 3 years, and there's different financial considerations and everything else. So no one should go to law school just because I did, but I'm always happy to talk to folks about their career path and anything that would ever be useful. If you cannot tell, I'm pretty deeply passionate about non-traditional policy and health policy in particular careers too. So open invitation to anyone here.
I would take her up on this offer. So before we switch to the segment where I'll turn it to the students, you built this place. You have a platform to speak on the most important issues of the day. You've worked in the White House. You've crafted a real, as I mentioned, a terrific reputation from the work you did on the ECA. But the one intriguing thing to me about your story is a little bit closer to the age of everybody here, which is it seemed like you went to like a really nerdy high school, right? I mean, like this was like it was a STEM high school for people who didn't even want to be in high school. They moved on to college, right? And that you studied a pretty heavy science load, and so that's an interesting way to get into this space. And maybe was it really the Peace Corps experience, or did you have a sense even as you were in your early 20s that you weren't gonna? When did you get a sense that maybe the science data path, in addition to the conversation with your friend at Christmas, maybe like when did you kind of get the sense that your interests were a little different than the path of a career as a scientist, which is an awesome thing?
No, I do think that conversation truly was quite crystallizing for me. And again, I was sort of in Peace Corps, you're kind of on your own, serving by yourself. You have a lot of time to consider. And then it was probably, I'm embarrassed to say this, I'm like cringing at myself. I really enjoyed studying for the LSAT and some of the logic games and everything else that goes into that. And it's sort of confirmed in a way that, interestingly enough, there's some biology folks in the room, so you should feel free to agree or disagree. I think kind of memorizing a lot of the information and understanding, and frankly doing neuroscience where you have to sort of do chemistry and physics and biology and connect everything so that you understand how the body works. I think it has helped me, even though I'm not doing science anymore, actually helped make connections, do the analytics, understand how multiple sort of systems can operate, whether they are political and policy and legal. So maybe that sounds really stupid. But I've had other people who have studied, I think, biology or neuroscience in particular say it changes how you think about the different problems that you might be facing, and to make connections that might not otherwise exist. So that is not at all what you asked me, but that is what it is conjuring for me.
Well, and I do think and I am not, as everyone here knows, the last science class of any substance I took was in 1978. So as you know, that I'm not, this is everything I've done is like learn on the job. But I will say that people I've met who came, especially people who did like systems biology and sort of ecology, where the assumption is that you have a lot of actors that, are operating in these various feedback loops. And like that's all I know is what I just said there. But it is an easier way to explain the political system and the policy world that at least we've both spent our lives in than a linear, like here's the three things you do and how's.
Right. It feels sort of natural
exactly.
to try to navigate
because they
amongst
interact
different
because
systems.
one action creates an my theory on like the ECA story is that we've ended up in court in part because it's so hard to do things in Congress, and people, when they lose, they're not prepared to lose. They look for the next battlefield.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
So I'm gonna now. So with that, I think we'll start. And I've got Maeve and Jenna. So Maeve, you're perfectly situated to kick us off. So why don't we start with you, and then Jenna, and then we'll open it up to the larger group.
So thank you so much for coming here today. This has been really awesome already. But I'm kind of more interested in like your work with LGBTQ groups as well as just minority groups in general and expanding access. So what like future work do you think needs to be put in place for minority groups in general just to have access as well as find insurance coverage?
That's a great question. And I have probably no answers. If to the extent that any answer comes out of my mouth, it is highly imperfect. I think to state the obvious, we're at a real moment of inflection, both on, I think, attacks on LGBTQ people and especially transgender people from this administration, but also kind of, what they refer to as DEI, but sort of health equity and a lot of the work that many of us have been doing on health disparities for a long time. So that, is the context in terms of what needs to happen. I think on transgender health in particular, I'm pretty laser focused on an upcoming Supreme Court decision. There's a case called Skirmeti that's over whether it violates the U.S. Constitution to ban gender-affirming care for minors. So this was argued in December. We'll wait on a decision, but it will presumably come in June. And the question will really be, and there's a link to, if folks care about this. If not, you should tell me no. But there is a sort of a question of if there's a link to Dobbs. Yeah. So on the one hand, I think there are some incredibly strong arguments, and the Biden administration weighed in that it violates the Equal Protection Clause to sort of target individuals based on their gender identity status, which even a conservative Supreme Court, Justice Gorsuch, in a decision called Bostock, sort of concluded sex includes sexual orientation and gender identity, and so folks should not be discriminated in employment based on, so trans people should not be discriminated in employment, The question has been sort of how much does that decision extend to other areas of life? The Biden administration took the position that, sex discrimination under Title IX, under Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, which is another sort of healthcare non-discrimination law. Title IX applies to education. Wherever sort of sex non-discrimination protections appeared, we took the position that it included discrimination against sexual orientation and gender identity. That has been tied up in court a ton. I think we are sort of all still waiting to see exactly what this Supreme Court will do. There are these kinds of gender-affirming care bans in about half of the states right now. They're limited to minors, but I'm already seeing attacks on gender-affirming care. That's hard enough. I'm already seeing attacks on gender-affirming care for adults. If I'm a little bit slower on the uptake today, it's because I was up very late writing about a new rule that the Trump administration issued yesterday. It's their first sort of major healthcare proposed rule. It's under the Affordable Care Act, and even that included a policy trying to restrict access to gender-affirming care for everyone, not
including
just
adults.
Including adults. And I would say, the attacks on transgender people serving in the military, inevitably attack healthcare access for transgender adults too. None of that was what we do. That is sort of describing the problem, but I think we are at a real inflection point waiting June. I am not someone who will give up hope around the court until we have the final decision, because, there are very strong arguments that this violates the Constitution, so we should wait and see. I think in the absence of that, it's going to be very challenging. A lot of people have compared what's going on abortion access to the attacks on gender-affirming care and sort of the state bans. For instance, some states have put in place what are called shield laws, where providers in states like New York or Massachusetts, their state is protecting them when they are providing care across state lines to, say, transgender people or women in need of an abortion. There's been a lot of parallels between the two movements. And we'll see what this sort of Supreme Court ends up doing. In Roe and in Dobbs and in this whole trajectory around reproductive rights, there had always been criticism that the constitutional right to an abortion was not grounded in equal protection and sex discrimination. Instead, it was sort of these different frameworks that the court had rolled out in Roe and KC that I won't get into. But that lacking is what kind of enabled the Dobbs decision for Justice Alito to really say, this isn't about sex, we're not targeting women, this is about states regulating healthcare. And so fast forward, if you think about this Skermeti case, the question before the court, is this about transgender people and sex discrimination and how you're targeting people based on their status in this particular class, or is it about states regulating healthcare? And so there is a world in which they sort of cite Dobbs and go down this kind of pathway and just say, this is just healthcare. This isn't about who it is. It's available to anybody, right. That kind of thing. And so that's what I'm kind of watching. In some ways, folks have not lost yet on the argument on gender-affirming care for minors. We are waiting to see if we will lose. And so in some ways, it's not exactly... It might be soon, but it's not yet at the same place of where we are in abortion access, where clearly states can impose all kinds of restrictions, as we've seen all across the country. So I probably made that way more confusing than it needed to be. I'm sorry, I'm a little tired. But, and the question about what we do is...
Where do we go? I mean, that maybe just to build on your question, where do we go? I'll jump ahead and say that I think the likelihood I just think the likelihood of this court to affirm the right of the state to regulate gender-affirming care for minors, my guess is they might punt on adults, but is pretty high. I mean, just given the 6-3 dynamic. So if that happens, where is it only going to be statutory and in places? Does that create a situation where really are going to be your rights are state by state?
Yes, I think so. And in this way that we have not really yet had to grapple with in the...
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump ahead.
No, that's perfect.
Maybe that's not where you wanted to go.
No, but in sort of... in the abortion context, right, we have seen huge numbers of women traveling out of state for care. If you need incredibly tragic stories, even women in emergency situations being forced to travel when they shouldn't have had to. And sort of that kind of service is kind of a one-time thing, right? You can have an abortion and sort of go home. Most people, it's not going to affect them. Gender-affirming care, depending on what service you need, but especially for minors, if you're doing things like puberty blockers, is ongoing care. And that, to me, is what is a little bit different here. Folks going to be able to travel on a regular basis, and that's why I think families are so understandably, concerned about what it means for healthcare for young people and young people in their life. So yes, and I think it could be worse and could end up with people moving and making significant decisions based on what this decision ends up being. And it might be that the Supreme Court says states can't ban it, but you can regulate it. Right. And we would have to sort of parse and see what that means. But you sort of made that point too.
I think that's just my guess. I'm an uninformed guess compared to Katie said, just looking at the trajectory we've been on. Jenna?
So, with like the importance of gender affirming care, like we just mentioned, how would you balance like protecting those rights with like political and economic pressures? Because I'm sure if you wrote something that's like less intense to begin with, maybe it wouldn't go as far in laws as it has currently.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to think how I would answer that. I think there's some. I think one of the challenges that we have seen, and I've seen some good analysis of this, sort of comparing things like marriage equality, which is sort of one time, right, you get to marry the person that you love. Not that the right is over, but there are sort of fewer things. I think your question about kind of what happens with access to care and how do you balance it, I think many people would look at this as from a fundamental human right framework of you need to have the health, the health care that you need. And so I often think about this in a I'll just answer it how I would frame it out, in sort of a non-discrimination framework. And so I've done an incredible amount of advocacy over time to eliminate transgender health insurance exclusions, which is not necessarily about fighting to make sure that every trans person has access to the health care that they need, not every single thing. But I would always say I'm just fighting so that trans people have access to the same shitty private health insurance that everybody else has access to, right? We don't cover everything for cancer,
Right. Oh.
people going through cancer treatment. The idea, so it's to me, it was always about giving people a fighting chance for what they needed and not having folks face discrimination based on who they are, based on their protected status. Again, that is not what you were asking me exactly, but I think there's always this, what is the kind of baseline that you need to protect to make sure that folks can get the healthcare that they need, that they can marry who they love, that they can go to job and have economic security, go to school and be safe and not be bullied, those kinds of things. And then I think what we are all grappling with is, and then how much more of those rights are sort of due. In gender affirming care, I think that has come up as more of a question. I have always been, I think, very focused on the parity argument. And as this has gotten much more thrust into the spotlight, these kind of almost like what folks consider follow-on questions of like how the non-discrimination provisions are as applied. What does it mean in a school? What does it mean in a hospital? What does it mean for an insurance company? That's where I think it gets a little bit trickier, where it's not exactly about fundamental human rights, but someone at some point has to draw the line and has to maybe balance some of, political challenges, or not even political challenges, but even practical challenges, economic concern, things like should you have, I'm thinking of things we had to grapple with. Should you have single stall restrooms everywhere? Like should an entire school be forced to retrofit only, gender neutral restrooms, or saying those kinds of things where, everyone should have the ability to use the restroom, their choice. But what does it mean when you're trying to sort of define and effectuate what that right means in real time? So again, not what you asked me, but I think there's sort of a baseline that in my view, most people should agree on, or maybe we're all striving to agree on. And then some variation about exactly what the details look like. Right now, we are not fighting on that baseline. We are folks are fighting for their, I think, basic rights. That's where we are, but that is, I think, one of the challenges to balancing all of it together.
I promise I won't do this for everybody. So can I just follow up to Jenna's? I think this is more of a question for you as a strategist than as an analyst, which is there are times, let me just say, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I think that the issue of transgender rights has gotten such political salience in this moment, and not in a positive way for people who are transgender. So the question is, I think first, how do you, obviously you're going to defend the lawsuits that are coming at you, but I also think about how you frame the affirmative agenda going forward is a strategic call, right? And obviously it's grounded in people's rights, but other rights movements have had to make hard strategic decisions along the way. I guess your thought, How do you sense this moment now? And when you're talking to a client or a group that you're advising, is this the moment to move ahead with more aggressive agenda? Is this a movement to hold ground that you're? And I guess I'd love your take on that.
No,
Was that kind of in the same vein as where you were, Jen?
No, by all means. Go for it.
and I think it actually harkens back to
Yeah.
kind of what do we do next too. So I that's exactly right. I certainly don't have all the answers to that question, which is a big one. I do think maybe less about the level of tactics. I think everything is very much in a defensive posture, both at the federal level and the state level, which we've talked about a little bit on these laws, but I think the attacks continue. There is certainly some education,
Right.
basic public education. It was not always the case that there was such negative attention on transgender people. For some time, the polling, again, maybe folks, I'm trying to remember her name. Even President Trump, when he was campaigning the first time around, spoke very positively about transgender rights, actually. You can go and find clips about, he's
Right.
like, I don't care what bathroom you use, that kind of thing. Like, we have really, I think, and I don't need to opine on why we are in such a scary political moment for transgender people. It wasn't always like this, and so I do think there is, I don't know if that means polling or it means sort of outreach, but the kind of humanizing work that I think was very effective in the marriage equality fight too, of like, this is who a transgender person, like how many people know someone who's transgender. And for a long time too, I think even on gender affirming care for minors, parents were incredibly powerful messengers talking about, the really hard decisions that they're making to, do the right thing for their kid. And so I'm not really an optimistic person, but like optimistic that I think we need to dig in on some of those types of strategies in addition to kind of playing defense and doing everything we can.
No, it all makes sense, but I just wanted to kind of put a finger on that. And so I guess now we can go around the room, or do people want to? We can just get started with. I mean, we always think about bouncing it back and forth, but it's just as simple. Why don't you start us off?
Thank you again for speaking to us today. We all have learned so much, so we really appreciate it. I guess my question was, for those of us who are planning to sort of pursue a career in medicine, like I'm planning to go to medical school, and I want to spend a lot of time with my individual patients, hopefully also doing some things on like a larger policy scale, but like wanting the individual patients to be a big part of my life. How do you see like individual providers being able to sort of advocate for their patients and still advance health equity even in sort of these tumultuous times on a policy level?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. And I think there's incredible, I mean, you're the front lines. There's an incredible amount of that individual physicians can do and will do, and nurses and, all sort of health professionals all across the I can't think of a more important role for a lot of this work, frankly. And so you could take that question in a couple of different directions. I mean, the fact that you're asking that question probably means you will give better patient care than the average doctor, because you'll be paying attention to whether it's social determinants of health or someone's cultural background or whatever your individual patient might need in that instance, which we know leads to better health outcomes when you have providers who understand, or at least are even trying to understand their patients' needs. And then I think that real world experience translates incredibly effectively to advocacy. In Congress before the administration, in my White House role, we worked a ton with doctors who would come in and tell us the stories about their patients who weren't able to speak for themselves for whatever reason, who could sort of share I'm thinking of a doctor who was a maternal fetal medicine specialist in Idaho, which has one of the strictest abortion bans in the country, and she ultimately, told stories of having patients who went into a seizure, and a pregnant patient going through a seizure who's just terrified that she's going to have to make a decision one way or another, which could put her in jail if she's prosecuted, and leave her kids without a mother, that kind of thing. She ultimately made the decision to move to Minnesota, to move her family and practice somewhere else. that was all decisions she was making in the emergency room in her own practice, but that she was able to sort of amplify to us, that we were able to amplify to others, so more people can understand. So that's even a simple example. But I think the experience of physicians, not even just on health equity, but I know one of the questions is about prior authorization. I mean, sort of any issue that you all are facing, having that background gives you an incredibly powerful, I think, voice, especially with training like this from a health policy class on top of it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And next, anybody next down the line here? Oh, okay.
Thank you again for coming to speak to us. This question is about your own career. It sounds like you got such a wide range of experience pretty early on, a lot of academic and hands-on things. Is there anything you feel like you missed out on that would be helping you now? Or any time that you spent that you think you could have maybe put to a better use, could have gotten started on later things faster?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't really thought about. Let's talk about all my regrets. Great. No, there is a part of me that I wish I had tried to be more of a real lawyer at some point and maybe practice. The thing I always regret not doing was maybe trying to clerk.
Yep.
To go where now that I do all of this, the judge is going to do this and write this opinion. And I think at the time I was like, oh, I couldn't possibly. I'm not that kind of lawyer. I think I talked myself out of it. And I really wish I could have done it for sure. Now that I'm at the age that I am now, I'm like, definitely could have handled that. But would have broadened that experience and maybe pushed a little bit further for some of those traditional experiences that I'm going to go off on my own path. And then in terms of things, I don't know. Again, very passionate about kind of non-traditional careers. I'm a big advocate in just sort of saying yes to the different, whatever excites you. And I never set out to work in the White House. I think a lot of people in DC do, and policy people. I did have in my head I sort of want to be in the room or around the room where decisions are made. And not that I was ever the ultimate decider on everything by any stretch of the imagination, but I felt like having had this experience, I've now sort of seen that, and now I'm trying to kind of think, what's next? Maybe sort of like box checked. What is now the way that I can have an impact, which might feel and look totally different. So I think being open to opportunities has kind of led me to, I didn't mean to do all of that you said and have this very eclectic thing, all these things happen to me, but maybe it wouldn't happen any other way.
Clerking is a great opportunity if you get a chance.
Yeah. I think it's worth trying, yeah.
Thank you so much for talking today. You mentioned how you felt like your undergrad, even though it was like in somewhat of an unrelated field, combined with your master's in law school, like very well prepared you for your career. What would you say though, like the biggest thing you learned like on the job that kind of was lacking in your educational experience?
Oh my gosh, like which job? Let's see. I mean, certainly.
Great question.
Mm-hmm. I mean, certainly the sort of government work that I've done now, nothing prepares you, is what I would say. I don't know. I need to think about that one a little bit more. It's a really good question.
No
I will say, I mean, the thing that it is making me think of, which maybe is also an answer over here, I spent a lot of time in law school and even in my undergraduate, checking things off that I did not want to do. So I tried different things that I was ultimately able to rule out. I worked at I had the science background, so tried an intellectual property law firm for a summer. I tried family law for a summer. To me, I was never convinced I would find the one thing I wanted to work on, so it was much more of a matter of taking things off the list, if you will. So that is other sort of unsolicited advice I would give you. And I think especially as young people and being in DC, you have an opportunity to go try to be on the Hill, try to work at a consulting firm if you want, try to be a paralegal, do all these things so that you know and you have a really informed, or try different kinds of, healthcare settings and mark those off the list that you want to do. So maybe I think going in, I at least knew the things I did not want to do, and it probably did help shape. And I still had to learn a ton of things on the job, mostly every day, including to navigate, but it's a really great question.
We'll slow down here.
I was really curious. You talked about how you contributed to the Following the ACA column for 5 years, and now you also still are writing a new column in Health Affairs. And I was curious, given the pace of recent executive orders and like changes to health policy, what are the maybe goals and challenges to providing such rapid response analysis while still maintaining like a high quality of writing and
Thank you. No, this I've been thinking a ton about, of kind of what is most useful in this moment. And I think if you read the note, you're probably all feeling it, right? There's just so much to pay attention to. There's a lot going on. A couple of pieces actually that there's a piece I did on Friday on kind of an update on, I took a hiatus in February, so I'm kind of catching up and digging out from all the things to write about all the things that happened over the past month.
Because if you ever work in the White House and you leave, take time off for vacation.
Take a break.
You're more tired than you think.
Yeah. But it is this sort of feeling like, I think my instinct, which is different from what I was doing before, and I don't know how this is going to work out, so it's all very fluid. What I was doing before would be like, one thing would happen and I would write about it. And then we'd go on and you would sort of reference back to it or make connections. I think there is so much going on. Fast forward to now, I think there's so much going on now. When I talk to reporters, they can't keep up with everything. They don't even know that X, Y, and Z happened. And so I actually feel like my job is a little bit less to do a deep dive on every little thing that happens and more to kind of round up and try to be kind of, I don't know what I want to say. I was going to say guiding light, which is not right, but kind of keeping things focused. So on this piece I did on Friday on reproductive rights, I think or not even reproductive rights, but all the different things that the administration has already done that in my opinion, have kind of flown under the radar. Executive orders, funding restrictions, ending a travel policy we put in for service members who have no choice about where they're stationed. And if you're stationed in a state with an abortion ban, you have to travel to get the care. So we, had a policy where we would help pay for that, or at least give them leave to travel to get the health care they needed. The President Trump signed an executive order on in vitro fertilization. They did some pardons. Like, there's a whole range of, even just from describing it doesn't make sense until you try to pull it all together and sort of put it in a framework. So I think my role this time around, certainly will do the nitty-gritty details, but also trying to just tell the story and keep it all together and really create maybe a framework for people to understand what's going on. And I feel extremely ill-equipped to be doing that. One of the pieces that is on my list that I haven't gotten to yet is sort of an overarching piece on the different agency processes that they're like all the different executive orders that have come out. Some guidance from HHS or the Department of Health and Human Services, where they're going to pull back on requiring public notice and comment on policy changes before they make them. The president signed an executive order that for every one rule you do, you have to pull back 10, right? And so if you think about each of these as, how are they going to do that? I saw your face, like what? How does that work? No one knows, but these things are not sort of isolated. And so how do you kind of put it together to try to explain to people what's going on in a way that I think is, I've tried to be accurate, fair. I did have that conversation with my editor when they asked me to come back to Health Affairs. It's like, I just worked in the White House. Are you sure you want me to be writing about what the next administration is doing? And I think it was, I have an editor, so we can make sure that I do it right, but and tone down as needed. But I do think it's sort of a challenge, but I'm trying to think about it a little bit differently to add value in a different way, because otherwise I don't think it would be super satisfying for me personally to just kind of do all these one-off things without really trying it together and explaining what's going on.
Well, I would argue that much like the ACA, but except times 10, there are just so many moving pieces that affect policy and government. It's not just the regulations, it's not just the guidance, it's the press releases that the secretary put. All these things have impact, and clarifying the legal space, where the authority exists and where it doesn't, is actually really helpful. So please.
I kind of want to piggyback off of that question, and then also going back to something you talked about a little bit earlier, but with all that information that's coming out and trying to understand everything that's going on, how do we, like me as a future nurse, how do I translate that into patient care and advocating for my patients?
That's a really good question. Fortunately, I would like to think that your day-to-day will not be so affected by a lot of what I am talking about, including like the proposed rule they issue, certainly not affecting your patient care. But it is making me think of, one of the things that the Trump administration did quite quickly was sort of take down a bunch of websites on the CDC, and that, Doctors for America and others sued over that. And part of it was because it complicated their patient care. So they pulled down guidelines for HIV, some guidelines on contraception, some other stuff too, but those were the kinds of things that, you had doctors writing and being like, I consult this all the time. Like, it is wasting, now I have to go look at this or find this, and it's wasting my time that I could otherwise spend with my patients. And that was, the court agreed and, made CDC and others put the websites back up, at least for now, while that continues. That is not a good example of how you sort of serve yourselves. But just to say, I think some of what we are talking about certainly does matter kind of in the exam room and everywhere else. I think for all of you who are kind of out there practicing medicine, there are incredible, sort of trade associations or, American Medical Association, Nurse Association, who we worked with all the time, thinking of ACOG and others, who I think do a quite good job of, they pay attention to all of this to help translate it down to those of you who are doing patient care and don't have time to be following all the nitty gritty, but again, can use your experience to advocate and kind of create that feedback loop. So I think that would be my sort of strongest recommendation. It's always good to pay attention to what's going on here, but, and to state the obvious too, which goes, I mean, a lot of your patients will be affected by the other changes that are unrelated to health policy. And so, thinking of like concerns about immigration or, folks having language access pulled back so things aren't translated in the right, there could be an incredible amount of things that are affecting the patients that are kind of tangential, but like very, very important to the care that you're providing. So it continues to be kind of staying abreast of all of that in a way that could really matter for them in terms of outcomes and access to. But all things I think you all already know, but that's what it's making me think of.
The more you stay informed, again, through associations or about the process, even at a very high level, then it gives you the tools to be engaged when you need to be that voice for your patients, whether it's on HHS regulations or broader issues. I think, and that's kind of the hope, I know, of the School of Nursing, for example, is to do that. And the School of Medicine is that you come out of here not only as really well-trained clinicians, but also people who are ready to be advocates in the larger world. So
it's super not your job to be doing that, but finding the people,
it's relevant.
It's so relevant, yeah. And again, you incredibly effective messengers. People love their doctors. People really love their nurses.
People really love their nurses. That is.
I have kind of a meandering question that I've been trying to shorten, and I think I've just made it longer. So, with this administration's kind of like scorched earth, like approach to DEI, especially in sort of how that's affecting NIH research and FDA's clinical trial requirements, I'm curious how like equal protections might serve to deliver some charge to address like biological differences that affect health outcomes, and sort of in the wake of affirmative action becoming less popular. And then like if those biological differences in like a legal sense constitute and sort of fulfill that like a court scrutiny requirement, like if that, where is that going? Where could that go? Where are the limits of that?
Like most of these answers, I do not have the answer to that of where is it going or what does it mean. No, the truth is I don't know. What it is making me think of is a lot of the work that we did on women's health research and the NIH since 2016 has had, it's called the sex as a biological variable policy, and it's the idea that just what it sounds like, sex is a biological variable, but that we need researchers, scientists, we need to be studying sex. It really means you need to be disaggregating data, breaking it down by men and women from sort of mice in the lab to so animal studies and human studies, really through the whole, and clinical trials, everything, to be unmasking if there are biological differences in treatment methods, in whatever you would need to know, dosage. I'm thinking of all kinds of different things. That policy, which has been around for a long time and I think has led to some of the scientific advances that we need. There was a recent study on Alzheimer's, for example, looking at women's brains, helps demystify some of the mechanisms there. And that type of language itself has been cited by, anti-LGBTQ advocates as, the entire argument for certain anti-trans things. So I think you have to be able to kind of hold all of these ideas, if you will, that there are going to be some of these differences that we can and should be studying. But I do have concerns about it sort of being weaponized in a way that is used to target a very vulnerable community. Other ways too, but I'm not sure exactly where it goes. I think some of the other kind of DEIA, less gender but race litigation and others, it's seeming like there's a real uphill battle there. I don't know if folks saw the headlines about a Supreme Court case about a woman claiming discrimination because she is heterosexual, and the court seeming inclined to, who knows, from the oral argument, we'll wait and see what they say, but there has been this concerted effort to kind of flip some of the case law and the protections and the development of that area of law, in my view, kind of on its head. And so I'm not watching and waiting to see kind of what happens there. So an equally, your question was great, but a meandering answer for me with not a good answer about kind of where do we go from here.
It's a challenge. It is a challenging moment. At least in my view, some, I don't know how many members of the court, but a significant number are really intrigued by what used to be called sort of the colorblind or sort of
Race
characteristic blind perspective of government. And there's a long tradition of that. It does, though, raise, if you buy into that, everything that you just talked about is called into question. The information you collect, the way it's organized, if it's like characteristics that people don't believe should be the business of government.
Yeah, no,
So.
and I do have deep concern. I mean, that is exactly right. It reminds me, you're starting to hear different federal agencies say, or orders from on high, we're just not going to collect data on race and ethnicity. We're not going to disaggregate the data in ways that, as good policy, students, that you need the data to see the problem. And so I am worried about kind of the loss of this generation. For example, there was a maternal health study that came out recently that showed overall, I think our maternal mortality is down. But of course it has gone up but it has gone up for Black women. And so we know that because we have the data. If we get rid of the part where we can see the disparities among Black women or Native women, we just won't know and we'll think, everything's fine. So that is the sort of long-term, almost structural things that I'm worried, whether people don't want to collect the information because it keeps them safer so that now the federal government won't have it. A lot of folks have had that concern, especially LGBTQ people. I'll just leave that there. Or because policymakers at the federal level are saying we don't want to track this anymore because we don't want to even know what the problem is. Is something I have really deep concerns about and could have extremely long-term consequences for our ability to do good policy, evidence-based policy.
Questions? Oh, there we go.
As someone who's very interested in looking at gender issues going forward, could you highlight some key cases coming up that could have very consequential effects for the future?
sadly, I can I can do that. I think the Scarametti one that I've already mentioned about state restrictions on gender-affirming care is going to be a big one. In part, like certainly on the impact on people, but kind of this distinction between what I said of civil rights framework versus kind of state regulation framework is going to be really important. If it's state regulation, it's going to continue kind of this movement for states to do all kinds of regulation on a whole host of different issues that I think folks in this room would care about. So Scarametti is definitely a big one. This isn't really a gender case, but there's another big case on the Affordable Care Act that's up before the Supreme Court again, which is on, you all might not be as familiar with this, but it's a requirement that health insurance companies cover preventive services at no cost. So things like PrEP for HIV, prevention, lung cancer screening. There's a big long list of probably 20 to 30 items that have to be covered. That is being challenged before the Supreme Court now is unconstitutional, so that will be a big one. It would affect coverage for about 170 million-ish people if it goes away. So that's another big case, not exactly gender, but obviously some disproportionate impacts on women there. There's a ton of reproductive health cases out there still. I think the main one but the one that I'm most interested in seeing where the Trump administration takes a position or how they come is over medication abortion. So I mentioned being from Amarillo, Texas, there is still this big case. This was up at the Supreme Court last year. The Supreme Court sort of punted on it, but it's continuing. You've got 3 states, Kansas, Missouri, and Idaho, who are continuing a lawsuit in Texas. Make that make sense to me. I don't know what those states are doing in Texas or why they can't sue in their own states, but I think it's because they want to be in front of this judge. They're suing over the FDA's regulation of medication abortion, one of the drugs in medication abortion, mifepristone. You all might know that medication abortion is the way that about 2/3 of women choose to terminate a pregnancy. It's the most common method of abortion. And so I think changes to access to medication abortion could sort of be even more devastating, including in states where abortion remains lawful. That's where it would have the most significant effect. So the Illinois and New York's and California's and DC's and Maryland's and Virginia right now, could see a really devastating impact there. The Trump administration has not yet been on record. We'll see if they defend FDA, as the Biden administration did strongly. I think their brief is now due on May 5th. It's like that's a date that's sort of circled in my calendar to get up and see what, the news of the day will be there too. There's also a couple new lawsuits over some of the policies we put in place at the Biden administration. So one of the things I worked on was a rule to strengthen HIPAA protections for reproductive health privacy. The concept was your medical records shouldn't be able to be used against you or your doctor or someone who helped you get care if the care that you were getting was lawful in the place where you got it. And so providers and other HIPAA-covered entities are not allowed. They're sort of banned from turning over reproductive health medical information if that's what it's going to be used for. But the administration was sued over that policy, including by the Texas Attorney General. So waiting to see what happens there. There's a couple big sort of cases like that. Trying to think about other things on the horizon. Rahimi was something that was decided, I want to say last year, if not the year before. That was a big domestic violence, a case at the intersection of domestic violence and gun rights, where the court upheld a law that made it easier to kind of keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers that we worked on. But that one's sort of settled at the moment, but I can give it some more thought too.
Comstock Act, is there anything on the horizon there, or is that just...
I think it would be tied up in this medication abortion case that I'm talking about. And I think if the Trump administration does anything on Comstock, including to, for example, pull back an advisory opinion.
Comstock is a law that was passed in the 1800s that prohibits basically the transfer through the mail of a wide range of products, including pornography, abortion products, and a whole sort of things that are seen as unsavory.
The
one way or
obscenity
the other.
statute.
Obscenity is a better way to say it. So the question is whether that would try to regulate the interstate distribution. So.
No, some have argued that means you can't send anything, not just abortion medication, but it could be gloves to a Planned Parenthood clinic. If you're using the mail, that could violate this law. So it could be, and we think that interpretation is wrong, and the Biden administration's been defending a different interpretation for a very long time. But if someone tries to take a different view, I think they would be, to threaten enforcement action, something like that, they would be sued and that would start something up. But I do think there's a couple different ways that issue could pop up.
Any other questions? Oh, there we go.
I'm curious about your time as a Peace Corps volunteer. Kind of two questions. What was most surprising to you about that experience? And then secondly, how did that kind of like intimate, hands-on experience with Ghana's health system, if at all, how has that informed your perspective on the U.S. health system today?
That's a great question. So I think taking the second one first, maybe it was less the health system. If I remember, no, you can fact check me and I'll be embarrassed. I'm pretty sure Ghana had universal health care at the time. It did not.
I mean, they've had
right.
had it for
That's
some
what I
time.
thought, yeah.
It's a work in progress,
Right.
but
Right.
important.
Yeah,
for the
it was.
board.
Yes,
It
and
was the first.
Right. Thank you. Okay. Did not make that up. Oof, okay. And I think there were challenges in. I lived in a rural village. There was a clinic. I don't think it was necessarily staffed as well as it needed to be. That kind of thing. I can't remember anything. I was very fortunate that I never had a medical emergency myself. I did have experiences with students with mental health challenges that watching sort of how that was handled or not handled probably did inform a lot of my views there too. And again, I sort of came back feeling like I would do more global health. And I think maybe one of the things that was most surprising that I learned, which SFS people, close your ears, although this is not what you're doing, but I thought I might want to do more international development coming out. Again, I'm like crossing things off my list of things I didn't want to do, and I'm glad I had that experience because I might have otherwise made a career out of that, and it ended up being something that was not the right thing for me. So maybe that was the biggest surprise, but coming back, the United States is its own the healthcare system has all of its own challenges. There's really nothing like it. And so I don't remember spending much time kind of comparing between the two or anything like that. But nothing's jumping out. It was a long time ago at this point. I'm just aging myself. But it's a great question and nothing is popping up for me at the moment.
Anybody else? Oh, Margaret? And then we'll save one for are there any questions?
We do, yes.
Okay.
So we have one for Bailey, who's a student in class.
She's in class. Okay.
Yes.
If you won't mind, Margaret, why don't we go to Bailey and then we'll come back.
So turning back to your work with LGBTQ people, specifically trans individuals, there are often significant activist and advocacy movements focused on protecting queer and trans health. As a lawyer, how do you bridge lived experiences and non-lawyer talking points into legal frameworks and mainstream discourse? In these cases, do you find that significant engagement from lay people is helpful in enacting these changes?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm going to kind of shift the question a little bit because I think it was about sort of the litigation and the brief. I mean, I think you need, I think in court cases and these arguments, obviously everything should be informed I say obviously to me, by lived experience, for sure. And I think you need sort of winning arguments for the audience that you have in front of you, which might be Supreme Court justices or it might be a district court judge. I think there is a role for maybe the answer to that question in some of the amicus briefs, for example. So there have been very effective amicus briefs where you have people writing about their own healthcare stories that get submitted. I worked on a Protect Trans Health coalition effort during the last Trump administration, switching not from court cases, but where you had, thousands of trans people submitting comments on federal regulations about their healthcare experience. And then, some of the work that I've done in the past was with an organization called Out to Enroll, which was about going and making sure LGBTQ people, not just trans people, but very much inclusive of trans people, understood the new benefits under the Affordable Care Act, because it feels very blasé now, but about 15 years ago, or when we were doing this work, starting in really 2013, that was pre-marriage equality. It was a lot of the things that we're all sort of very familiar with today. And LGBTQ people still are, but especially then, had been so discriminated against in the healthcare system that we did some polling, or some message testing and everything else, and realized that if someone did not go out and do the public education to say Obamacare works for LGBTQ people, includes same-sex couples and same-sex families, includes trans people, people would just assume that it didn't, because you'd had this long history of discrimination. It makes total sense when you think about it, but we, some colleagues and I, saw that as a real gap of who's going to do that work, to do the outreach and make sure people understand their rights. And so we, formed this organization to go out and do that, which is very focused on, people in all, states all across the country. So we would go and do and travel and try to make sure we would raise awareness and make sure people understood their rights. We also used that experience to hear about the problems on the ground, and then, talk to the people and here in DC to get some of the challenges fixed. Sometimes it took too long, sometimes it wasn't perfect, but you sort of have that really important feedback loop where the lived experience in that exact situation can feed into, the policy solution and keep it targeted. And, there were times where we, again, it was way back. We were working with we heard from a couple in North Carolina. North Carolina still banned marriage equality, but this couple was married in a different state. But when they went to enroll in health insurance through healthcare.gov, by the time they did it as a family because they were married and that's how they filed their federal taxes. But by the time it got to Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Carolina, Blue Cross Blue Shield is like, well, we don't recognize that here. We can't possibly enroll you as a family. And so that was the exact kind of story, got some media attention, probably because we helped it get media attention, but then we worked with, at the time, the Obama administration to get guidance to fix that issue so that insurance companies were not denying same-sex couples. We did the same thing around, there were lots of reports, and still this happens today, but it's a lot better. These preventive services that I just talked about, things like prostate, we think of some sex-specific services, so men need prostate cancer screening, or what's another good, women need cervical cancer screening, that kind of thing, depending on what your body parts are, right? There are trans men who might need cervical cancer screening, there are trans women who might need prostate cancer screening, and so we got guidance to sort of clarify that, whatever your doctor says you need, regardless of what's on your gender marker on your insurance card, or your gender identity, or your sex assigned at birth, if your doctor says you need that care, you get that care. So those are the kinds of examples where I think seeing the real lived experience could then help translate into the policy changes that happen. So I think it's incredibly important. I think the tactics and strategies you use and also matter, and sometimes who the messenger might be to specific audiences to maximize your chances of success is also very important. But I don't know if that's a good answer there. That's what's making me think about. There's a role for all of it too. That's just been my experience and how it sort of played out for me.
Let's see, other questions here? So one more, and then Margaret, did you have a question too? Or is
I did.
well, why don't we start, and then we'll go to you.
Well, we've heard a lot about kind of your experiences in law school and how that really helped you kind of throughout your career. I was wondering a little bit more about your experience with the MPH and what kind of were some of the most significant moments of that for you, as well as what are some of the things you think were most helpful for you, whether that be skills or experiences kind of moving forward.
I feel like a bad person. I don't think I got much from my MPH. I think that is what it comes down to.
We love the people at Georgetown.
We love them. It was great. I enjoyed my time there, and I could not tell you. Part of it too.
I appreciate your candor.
I don't know. I'm too tired to make something up also. That sounds good. No, it's a very great, it's a terrific program. When I sort of made the comparison to 3 years in law school to 1 year in the master's program that I did, I think part of it is law school felt much more, and even then you're not learning at any level of depth now that I've taught law school classes, but it felt a lot more intense, like you could really build the skills. I found the MPH was a lot faster. You sort of had different classes I think the terms were like 8 weeks long. There was a lot, part of it is that there was a lot that we did and a lot that we learned, and none of it, I just wasn't using it. I'm also a little bit biased by the time I ended up in the master's. It used to be that they want you to do your first year of law school and then your master's degree and then come back for your last 2 years of law school. And I said, I'm not doing that. Thank you very much. I wanted to do all 3 years of law school to stay with my friends. And then I wanted to do the master's at the end. And so part of it is I was doing the master's at the end and I was already a full-time faculty member at Georgetown. Yeah. So I was already working sort of here, trying to wrap up. That's probably the better explanation. It has nothing to do with there, but I had kind of already, it was an incredibly important signaler for me when I was in DC. I think it probably did open the door for me. When I was doing internships on Capitol Hill, for example, it was that real signaler that I was very interested in health policy, that I think it very much aided me that way. But the actual, unfortunately, I'm sorry, but the actual curriculum and experience, it was really good people. I had really good friends in the MPH program. That is probably what sticks out to me the most, but I'm having trouble drilling down on a specific class or something like that, which is what you asked. Sorry.
Margaret,
I'm not saying don't go to get a master's in public health.
Well, no, I mean, I do think one challenge of the joint degree programs is that it's a lot of graduate school. Now, for those of you going to medical school, it's not that much. Right? But it's a lot of time. 4 years is a long run. Margaret, you get the final word, the final question.
So I'm also from Texas, and so I've sort of been interested in immigration, but I saw something just this morning about like the reversal of CMS policy that sort of extended some level of coverage to Dreamers, and I'm just curious, like if you've done any research specifically around sort of policies that expand or restrict sort of healthcare access to
yes, that is the rule I was up all night writing about for health affairs. It should be out tomorrow. It also has some of the stuff on gender affirming care in it. It was this sort of big 300-page rule. Again, the Trump administration's kind of first rule on Affordable Care Act stuff. But no, last year, the Biden administration did a rule extending, this is Obamacare eligibility to Dreamers. And they did so by clarifying the definition of what it means to be lawfully present, which is, an eligibility restriction for Affordable Care Act coverage. So that happened, I think, in March of last year, if I'm not mistaken. We were sued by 19 attorneys general, Republican attorneys general, over the policy led by the Kansas Attorney General, I think. And so it's sort of stopped. They, after they sued, they went through the proceedings. They won what's called a preliminary injunction, and that has meant that Dreamers in those 19 states have not been eligible. So, again, we keep creating these sort of two-tier systems, whether it's abortion access or gender affirming care or eligibility for private health insurance. In this case, folks have not been eligible in those 19 states. So that's kind of the status quo. And then enter this new regulation by the Trump administration, which doesn't roll it back right away. Like, nothing's changing right this second, but they're coming in and proposing, and so then they have to take comment on that, but saying, we want to go back to that old definition of lawfully present. We think, and it's awkward, right? It's supposed to be the same agency. So it's like HHS, we thought this, and then we thought that, and now we think this, and it's all we, and they have to really kind of tie themselves up in knots as you change positions over and over again, but you have, there's requirements that you have to justify why you've made a policy change. And so, they gave their rationale. It was in part based on this court decision also. But no, I think that's exactly the policy. In terms of other research, or I have focused a little bit less on this intersection. So I don't have as much, but it would be happy if there's like more specific questions about like immigrant health, would be happy to chat too. I will say one thing they did say in this rule from yesterday, they acknowledge that Dreamers are, sort of would say it hurts the risk pool, but it's because dreamers are by definition younger and healthier. And so by keeping out younger and healthier people from going in to get health insurance, you know, it's going to cost everybody else a little bit more. So kind of they have to grapple with those kinds of implications too, not just kind of the immigration, like what will this mean for health insurance premiums, that sort of stuff. But they did at least kind of acknowledge that impact there on other people.
Margaret got the last question, but you have the last word if there's any final thoughts you want to share with the group.
No, thank you for having me. You were in exactly the right place to be doing, and just what an incredibly impressive compilation of people and all your different backgrounds and all the things that you're doing. But I mean it very sincerely that I'm available at any time. I really am quite deeply passionate about this, whether it's law school or something else. So please, you know, definitely don't hesitate to use me as a resource.
How about a round of applause for our guest?